we have Chavod playing white and Ble, aka Boongi, playing black. And so we started with e4, knight f6, f3, e5, d3, c6, and c4. It's a very interesting structure. I would say that typically speaking, you don't see knight f6 on the second move in response to e4, simply because e5 can then be played by white, restricting black's space. But white declined to play that move, instead opened up the king's side with f3, also generally not considered to be a sound move. That is alright. Once again, we now see c5, another instance of a player moving a pawn forward only one square, and then later moving it forward 2 squares. We see bishop e3, targeting the c5 pawn, but of course black defends by playing b6. This position is very locked up. No pieces have yet been taken off of the board, and the pawns are in positions where we may see a very closed game. Additionally, this black bishop, if it's not careful, could end up being trapped. It has nowhere to retreat to. See, queen b3, followed by a5, followed by a queenside castle. If white decides to push this pawn on the d file to d4, we could see an opening of the position, allowing this rook to get into the action. Now, if this knight from white moves, it could end up being very dangerous for black. Once again, this bishop is trapped. It has nowhere to retreat to. So if a move like a3 is played, the only place for the bishop to go would be to take on c3, or to take the pawn, but that would be less than ideal. Instead, however, we see a4 actually being played by white, removing that opportunity entirely. We now see black castle on the king's side, and generally speaking, black does have a favorable position. White's king is wide open, and they are generally lacking piece development, but still, the game is not by any means decided. Still, no pieces have been taken off the board, so material is even. Additionally, white is continuing to advance their pawns, making more space for their pieces. Black has played h6, and white responds with h4. These last few moves have been very interesting. White started with a not so great position, but the more moves they make, the more space they get. And if white is able to carefully maneuver their pieces along the board, with their pawns moving forward, they could be in a favorable position. Additionally, it doesn't matter how much in danger your king is if black is unable to attack it. We now see h5, obviously. It can be taken, though it is not a free pawn because black can take it right back with the knight. However, I have to say, this position is looking more and more frightening and complex by the second. Reminder, neither of these players are particularly highly skilled relative to the global landscape of chess. And now, white seems to be pushing their advantage. Knight h7 being played by black, retreating the knight. Once again, white is pushing their pawns, creating space, and pushing black back. If black is not careful, it could be a very dangerous position for them. Now we see knight d5, moving the knight out of the way of the black bishop. And now we see why the a3 move would have been much better than a4, because now the bishop has nowhere to retreat to. However, the only way to attack it is with the queen at the moment. With knight d5, white continues to put on the pressure, advancing their pieces forward. So we'll see how black decides to respond. Will black decide to develop for themselves? And now we have f6 being played by black. According to the engine, a very bad move. Best response for white right now is g6. g6 is played by white, and now the only place for black to retreat this knight to is g5, which of course is under attack by two of white's pieces. So this knight, for all intents and purposes, is off the board. What is this best response for black? Well, potentially try to create a counter threat. If they can attack one of white's pieces, or if they can set up some kind of mating threat, that would be ideal. However, it doesn't seem likely that will happen. We now see f5 being played. It does create a square for the black knight, so if white does not take the knight now, it could end up escaping. Additionally, taking this knight gives a check, forcing the king to move, though it would likely simply take back the pawn. We see king h7. And now black is in a precarious situation. Their pawns have advanced, and now black has an open diagonal for the bishop. The queen could potentially move over, the rook could move over once these knights develop, and there is already a knight on d5 in position to attack the black king near the center of the board. And once again, even if there is no attack, it is still very possible for white to win this game simply by being up material. With the advance of f4, it only further opens up the position, allowing white to create more opportunities for their attack. How will black respond? They need to make sure that their king is safe. If they're not careful, they could end up losing very easily. And in fact, even if they are careful, they could still lose very easily because of the material difference. At this point in the game, it is on white to lose this game. We've seen knight e7. Potentially trying to move the knight towards the king to offer some protection. Now what will white do? Both players are even on the clock, so time is not a large issue at the moment. And we see bishop takes on b4. We see a takes on b4. Now, although white is still up material, their attack is a little bit weaker because of the loss of that knight, and black's bishop on b4, as mentioned earlier, was not doing very much. So the fact that the bishop is off the board is not much of a hindrance, and it also opens up the a file for the black rook. We now see the f pawn for black moving forward to f4 because of f takes e5. The bishop moves out of the way. Very standard. After all, the pawn was protected by this rook on f8. And now we'll have to see how the game continues. Black could slowly start to climb back into this game if this pawn is left on the board. Additionally, most of White's pieces are on the king side, and so if Black can somehow find a way to infiltrate on the queen side, White's king could be in danger. We see bishop b7 played by Black, attacking this pawn. So if the d3 pawn were to fall, Black could potentially take on e4. Slowly, Black is obtaining a time advantage. Maybe that is Black's main win condition. We now see knight f3 played, further stacking pieces on the f-file, preventing the f-pawn from moving forward for Black. White wants to do everything in their power to prevent the queen from appearing on the board. What will Black do? They don't have many options or places to put their pieces once again. White's early game pawn pressure has afforded them some space to move their pieces around, and now, with d6 being played, it allows White to fix one of their weaknesses, these e-pawns. First, we see an in-between check, knight g5, moving that knight to a better position. Of course, Black can't do anything in this position, like take on c4 or e4. They have to move the king. Where will they move it? They go king g8. We now see e6, played by White, and this seems to be an elimination of their main advantage. Black can now further open up the position, playing something like d takes on e4, developing some of their pieces. White has given up an opportunity to restrict some of Black's freedom. In fact, the engine believes that bishop c6 is the best move, attacking this pawn, which makes sense. The only defender is the queen, and no other piece can possibly defend it. The fact that White did not take this d-pawn with one of their pawns means that this move is available. However, Black takes on e4. This still does allow the bishop c6 move in the future. However, there are some dangers that Black may have to face soon. For example, if we see d takes on e4, Black will have to defend their queen. The rook gets a discovered attack on the Black queen. Instead, we see bishop h3, and we see e takes on d3. Black actually had a much better move there, according to the engine. And if we take a moment to look back, that move was e3. The reason for this is it attacks the bishop on f2 and also has an open discovered attack for the bishop on b7 to take the rook on h1. However, that was not what was played. We had d takes on e4 for Black, and then we had bishop h3. We had e takes on d3. We had rook takes on d3, and we had queen c8, moving the queen out of the way. So, we are now left in a position where White is very far ahead. A lot of their pieces are active. Black's rook on a8 really still can't do anything, but at the same time, neither can White's queen on b3. We see rook e1 developing this rook. And This passed pawn on e6 could be very dangerous, as well as the fact that the king is wide open on g8. A lot of white's pieces could end up getting into the attack here. You see b5, trying to create a pawn break potentially. If this pawn takes, it would be forking the queen and rook for white, but it wouldn't be protected, so it could simply be taken back. And we see c takes on b5. The generally expected move. However, there's an interesting tactic here with what I mentioned before, a pawn fork on the queen and rook. This time, instead of the b pawn taking on c4, we simply have the c5 pawn advancing to c4. And this pawn would actually be protected by the queen on c8. If black were to play this move, they would not only be back in the game, they would actually be slightly ahead. And black does play it. c4, forking the queen and the rook. How will white respond? They cannot take back with the queen, otherwise they will simply lose the queen for free. Their best option, likely, is to take on b4. They end up losing the rook, but remember, they were already ahead by a piece. Queen takes on b4, the expected move. Pawn takes on d3. It actually gives black a discovered check on the king. So that would not be a bad move by any means. And now, material is almost equal. White will be down a rook, but they will have traded a bishop and a pawn in exchange. So not the worst thing in the world. The position is certainly still salvageable for white. Additionally, both players are getting fairly low on the clock, almost 3 minutes for both of them. And we are still not very close to an endgame. This is still very much so the middle game stages. So if both players end up low on the clock in the endgame, we could see some blunders. Black does not take on d3. They go knight to g6, likely afraid that their knight was under attack by the white king. What they didn't realize is that they would get a discovered check on the king, allowing them to protect their knight afterwards. Now, all white has to do is move their rook out of the way, move it away from d3, and they'll be in a very winning position. Rook d6. Black had the opportunity to come back in the game, but they didn't see the discovered check. They only saw the threat on their own pieces. It's important to realize in a chess game, it's not a one-player game. You have threats and your opponent has threats. You have pieces and your opponent has pieces. Now, black plays knight takes on h4, but white can simply take that piece back. Alternatively, they could even just try to promote this pawn. But no, white takes the easy move, take the knight back, and now black is very much so not in a good position. They're down a lot of material, 2 full pieces, a knight and a bishop. This passed pawn on e6 is making its way up the board, maybe going to make a queen. And black's king is still not safe. This open diagonal could be very dangerous. There is a knight and a pawn looking at the escape squares for white, or for black rather. What will black do? How can black create a counter threat? That is likely what they are thinking right now. Another interesting thing to look at all of white's pieces. A majority of their major pieces are on dark squares, countering the effectiveness of black's light squared bishop. Yes, most of the pawns are on light squares, but at the end of the day, they're also all protected. Black plays f3. White plays a calm rook to f1. This pawn is not going to be promoting anytime soon. However, it still cannot be easily taken. White has 2 attackers, black has 2 defenders. Black plays rook to f6. But now, e7, once again, looks very interesting. And in fact, it looks even harder for black to defend than before. The queen is protecting the e7 square. So if the rook moves up to d8, you can prevent any pieces from stopping the pawn from promoting. We see rook b6 instead, attacking this bishop. But now, in some ways, it allows black to fix their bishop. It was not a very useful piece before, but now it's been able to develop to some squares where it might be useful. It's now attacking this pawn, and if e7 is played, it can be very dangerous. We can see rook takes b6. We see a5 played instead, trying to create 2 passed pawn threats. And in fact, there is a 3rd passed pawn threat on b5 if this rook were to move out of the way. But now, this rook is looking trapped. It doesn't have many squares to go to, the only one really being d6. So if it came under threat, it would be hard to make it out alive. But now, after rook to f4, e7 is once again available for white to play. We see the bishop moving out of the way of danger to g5. This rook doesn't have many places to go, and if it wants to continue to protect this pawn, it has to stay on the f file and move back. Instead, we see rook e4, which is potentially even worse. Now, your bishop is not even defending the f3 pawn. Black is getting very low on the clock, only 1 minute left. White has a solid 40-second time advantage. See queen e7. Black now has less than 1 minute, almost an entire minute advantage for white. In this endgame, we see rook to a7. This is, of course, simply a hanging rook. White takes it. How will black counterattack? Black is being given time on the clock by white. Not typically what you would see in a competitive match. Black has now given some time to white. Black is still down a minute on the clock, and now they're almost down 2 minutes on the clock. They've yet to make a move. Black retreats their bishop to a8. Now, I anticipate that rook b8 could be coming. The black queen would be pinned. Instead, we see e7. Not the worst move in the world. Once again, just trying to move forward toward making another queen. Black doesn't have many moves to defend. Queen a8 is one of them. If white does not further defend, the black rook can take, protected by the queen. However, this bishop is in a precarious spot. Additionally, the rook was hanging. Still, black does not have many threats. There we go. Rook b8. The queen is pinned. Black will be losing their queen shortly without much counterplay. Black continues to be given time on the clock. We see king f7 moving out of the way of the pin. So if white decides not to take, though they do, black now takes, queen b8, and the king takes the passed pawn. We now see b6, making use of these two other passed pawn threats. White is doing a very good job of seeing where their advantages lie and attempting to push them. But now we might see a queening race. Black is pushed up to g5. White moves their bishop out of the way of a potential attack. But now, the white bishop is under attack again on the light squares. We now see bishop to h8, ignoring this threat to the bishop. But now, black moves their king. White takes the pawn. Black takes the pawn. The queen moves. The king is in check. Once again, the king is in check. And the bishop blocks. This is a very hectic game at the moment. It is almost difficult for me to keep up with the moves going on the board. White is up a full queen and rook. But now black is attempting to make a queen. They actually missed the free rook. They had the potential to capture that rook and maybe make a queen. The king moves back instead of moving forward. b7 is played. White is one turn away from getting another queen. But black is as well. And now, after rook takes on f2, black has another queen. However, it is of course immediately captured by the white queen. Almost all of black's threats are now eliminated. Is there a way for black to come back into this game? You see king c5, rook f5, king b4. You now see rook f2, and c3, queen b8, turning into a queen. You see king takes on a5, bishop f6. The players are moving very quickly despite white having a lot of time on the clock. I suppose the material advantage makes them not too worried of blundering. But we could see a stalemate. That may be black's best chance of not losing this game any longer. See, c takes on b2 and king takes on b2. And now we simply have a checkmate in one on the board for white. It is not played. Black is still in the game. However, they're dangerously close to being checkmated. After king a3, black does not have very many moves. They play bishop c4. And as long as this bishop can move, there is no stalemate. But now that it's off the board, there could be drawing chances, but instead, we see bishop d8 check.
Can you hear me?